Hello and welcome to this fourth installment of Anteron's rather irregular dose of atheism, the show in which I deal with questions, especially from theists, that I have come across in Facebook land. The question today is, why do you dismiss the philosophical arguments for the existence of God as insufficient? It's quite a mouthful, so during this I will refer to them simply as the philosophical arguments, or even shorter, TPAs. There are around 36 of them. Some count a few more, others less. There are several subgroups and so on. Please do not expect me to recount them all now. But there are 8 classes in which the arguments are separated. There are arguments from cognition, cosmological arguments, arguments from design or purpose, arguments from miracles, ontological arguments, arguments from religious experience. There are arguments that come in the form of a wager that claims that probability indicates the existence of a God. And there is one last group that is called arguments from values or morals. I would say that at the moment, the Kalam cosmological argument and the argument that objective moral values exist are the most prominent examples and most often used by theists to support their claim that their God exists, partly because William Lane Craig has been beating these dead horses for a long time and hence popularized them. That is why I will take a short look at especially these two. I will not bother refuting them in detail. Others have done that. You will find videos on YouTube if you look for it. I will just present them shortly and state points that I disagree with, and they will be my representatives for TPAs in general. So, first we have the Kalam cosmological argument, which is one variant of the general cosmological arguments. It reads as follows. Premise 1. Everything that has a beginning has a cause. Premise 2. The universe has a beginning. Conclusion. Therefore, the universe has a cause for its beginning. That is it. William Lane Craig and most theists actually are adding more conclusions or better assertions at this point, and they try to make it look like they are logically deduced from the premises, but they aren't. They do not follow from the premises at all. These conclusions are that cause is God, which is just an assertion, or therefore God exists, which is asserted and not deduced from the premises. So, from the outset, the Kalam does not do what the theists want it to do. They have to tweak it and pretend that it does. It actually says nothing about the cause itself, especially not that it has to be a timeless, spaceless, and intelligent agent, which is the extra step they take to get to the assertion that because that description fits nicely with how the God of classical theism is defined, and that God is most definitely our Christian God, so the Kalam shows that our Christian God exists. Not so at all. All of these attributes like timeless, spaceless, and intelligent are just more assertions coming from absolutely nowhere. There is no way to get there logically from the premises of the Kalam. So now let us look at the bare bones argument. Premise 1, premise 2, and the conclusion. The first premise is not demonstrated, it is just an assertion. That is actually the crux of most, if not all, philosophical arguments. The premises are never demonstrated and do have no connection to a testable and verifiable reality. But in this case, the premise seems to actually have been refuted by quantum mechanics. I do not claim that with certainty, but it seems that in quantum mechanics, particles appear with no discernible cause. But I leave quantum mechanics rather to the experts in the field. But in any way, we have no example of anything beginning to exist. because everything that we see is constituted of pre-existing matter, matter that existed since the beginning of the universe. The second premise has a problem because we cannot get further back than the Planck time after the Big Bang. The Planck time is a minuscule fraction of a second, and that is where the veil falls, and we cannot look further back in time to the actual origins of the universe. So, it was never observed that the universe actually had a beginning, and even the cosmologists, Guth, Vilenkin, that William Lane Craig uses to bolster his assertions, are known to clearly state that they disagree with Craig's interpretation of their work. I will link to a web page where you find more on that if you want to check that out. The first premise is actually cleverly reworded by Craig as to make the special pleading fallacy that follows not so obvious. The original reading of the Kalam was just everything has a cause, and the statement about God was except God. Because this makes it obvious that God, for no apparent reason and with no justification, breaks the rule established in the first premise, Craig adjusted the Kalam to read, everything that has a beginning must have a cause, now claiming that God is the one thing that always existed and hence it needs no cause, preventing the infinite regress of gods that are causing each other until one God finally decides instead to create a universe. Nice try, but it is still a special pleading and begging the question fallacy. Craig then tries to equivocate the infinity of numbers with an infinity of events, claiming that if we have an endless chain of events in either direction, we could never get to the point of the origin of the universe or to where we are now. It does not really make sense to me, but I admit right here and now, contrary to others that have done so, I am unable to refute it myself, and I have to rely on these others. You can find detailed videos debunking the Kalam on YouTube. Just put Kalam demolished, debunked or destroyed into the search and you will find many videos, but especially 1 hour-long video will pop up with an in-depth refutation of the argument as presented by William Lane Craig, which I consider to be brilliant. I will link it in the description box. The second premise, as already pointed out, is asserted as well. We do not know if the universe actually had a beginning. The Big Bang seems to be the beginning of the universe as we perceive it. That does not mean that it cannot have existed in some other form before. That's the Kalam dealt with. Now the argument from objective morality, one that I really hate. Premise 1. If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Premise 2. Objective moral values do exist. Conclusion. Therefore, God does exist. What a pile of horseshit. The first premise is an assertion. Plus, what are objective moral values in the first place and how are they connected to the existence of any God beyond the mere assertion? Nothing is forthcoming on that from Craig or any theist. Objective is what can be compared to a defined standard. A meter is a meter because it is a defined standard, defined by humans for some purpose. Where is God's standard defined and what would be the recognizable purpose? Craig will say, it's in God's nature. But can God determine its nature itself? Or is it determined by someone or something else? If God determines its nature itself, it is just its opinion, not some objective standard. And if it does not, something else is actually defining the standard and God is just the messenger. So either it is God's subjective opinion or God is completely irrelevant. There is nothing objective to be found here. And just because 99.9% of humanity agrees on something, like for example that murder and rape are bad, does not make it objective either. Yes, I can make the claim that murder and rape are objectively negative actions, but only if I first define goals that I and the society I am living in are agreeing on, like the protection of the life and property of its members and the reduction of harm and suffering. I will deal with this in more detail on an episode about secular morality, I hope. Basically, the argument from moral values existing makes morality synonymous with God, which is just ridiculous, as shown. But what makes this even more annoying is that it makes the argument circular, basically saying God, morality for which God is synonymous, exists, so God does exist. I don't want to get into the morality of the Bible here, but I think we can all agree that the morality in the Bible is not objective and not generally good. But that is another topic for a later episode. So as I said, if goals are defined, actions that can objectively be judged to be immoral and should be restrained do exist. I doubt that there are actually things that can be judged moral, because we do not legislate and enforce moral behavior. We just try to restrict immoral and hurtful behavior. That is why only negative things are always mentioned as objectively immoral. They never say this is objectively moral. And that is actually the one objective thing. If an action harms someone, it must be seen as morally questionable. Suffering might be justified, like the prick of a needle to vaccinate someone, because it prevents greater suffering, by averting the actual disease and maybe an epidemic. But the morals of the action and the motivation behind causing suffering must be questioned. But that is not what Craig is talking about. He is talking about an overarching, objective moral framework, which I rather would call an absolute moral framework, based on the authority of God, divine command theory, and the basis is the Bible. Societies adapt their morals constantly, from the abolishment of slavery to the acceptance of LGBTQ rights and marriage equality. There are things that were always wrong, like slavery, but it took humans centuries to actually realize that. So, these philosophical arguments clearly fail, and I claim that all the other philosophical arguments fail as well. There are some other less structured arguments, but some of these are basically fallacies in and of themselves, like the appeal to popularity or to authority of some celebrity or so-called expert. Yes, if an expert in a particular field says something about the field they are an expert in, their position should be valued higher than the opinion of some self-pronounced expert on YouTube or Facebook on the same topic. But it still does not make the opinion of the expert the word of God and gospel, and especially not if they are stating opinions on things they are not an expert in, like the existence of God. Be skeptical even then. One of the worst arguments you find is Pascal's wager, at least as presented by most theists. It is better to believe and to be wrong than to not have believed and face the wrath of God. There is so much wrong in this one sentence. It assumes that one actually wants a God to exist and that this God grants us some form of afterlife that we want to get to. Sorry, but if I die and there is a God, all I'm going to do is to request that this God ends my existence right there on the spot. I do not want an afterlife, be it in heaven or in hell. Why, you wonder? I guess I will have to deal with that in a later episode. But that is my answer to Pascal's wager. And there are so many more problems. What about different gods, of which there are supposedly many? What about the fact that we cannot simply choose to believe, and it cannot be faked, especially not when the God presented is omniscient? What about the cost of belief, the efforts made and the time wasted? Pascal fails on every level. Last, I wanted to address the, in my opinion, most ridiculous argument, which is the modal ontological argument, with the assertion that a maximally great being exists and the jump from one possible to all possible to this particular universe without explanation or justification. It just so happens that one of the attributes of the never ever demonstrated but just asserted maximally great being is existence. The whole thing is pure assertion and circular arguing, because what needs to be shown to exist is just asserted to exist, because existence is included as an attribute of the being itself. This is an exercise in futility, to be honest. Anyway, the answer to all philosophical arguments for the existence of God is my personal atheist mantra, with which I'm going to leave you now. A God that has no evidence for its existence, that cannot be detected in any reliable and verifiable way, is indistinguishable from a God that does not exist. There can be no reason to believe that such a God exists, even if in fact it would exist, and it cannot be appealed to as the cause for anything, be it the universe or as a source of some holy book. It would have to be shown to exist independently before such appeals can be reasonably made, and no believer ever came close to do that.